Dear friends, good evening. Thank you for joining us this week to another lecture in our pre-chamber series. Today, our topic is titled The Awakening of the Consciousness. Tremendously important topic because this lecture becomes a good foundation to the topics later on astral travel and meditation. The connections may not be immediately evident, but as we go through the material, you will come to see what we mean by it. So let's start by saying, when it comes to awakening the consciousness, most people believe that they are already awake. As a matter of fact, right now, you find yourself sitting on your chair looking at the screen, and just those perceptions give you an indication that there is an observer that is present and that observer is active. But let's take a look at what Samael tells us. He says, the rational animal drives his car while asleep, works in the factory, in the office. While asleep, he falls in love, dreaming. And in doing that, he gets married, and he gets married dreaming. He lives in a world of dreams and is convinced that he is awake. Now, of course, many of us have experienced this many times. It has been very common to see ourselves, perhaps so many other friends, who are walking around looking for their glasses while they're wearing their glasses. They have been looking around for their keys while they have the keys in their hands. We have even seen the maybe most extreme cases of friends who have texted others asking, "Have you seen my phone?" when they have just used the phone to send a text message. So here, we carry ourselves around, but we are so distracted, so caught up with everything that is happening to us, that we are, for the most part, completely unaware of the things that are taking place, what is truly happening around us, even the things that we are perceiving. So this exercise on awakening the consciousness, it has to become a deliberate exercise. But we cannot start that exercise until we acknowledge our current condition. This is why Samael tells us the moment we reach the conclusion that everyone wanders through life while asleep is when we start comprehending that we need to awaken. And this process of awakening has some very interesting, simple exercises. However, the causes for the lack of this awareness, the causes behind the sleep of the consciousness are very, very specific. And we fall into this lethargy because of a condition called identification. And identification takes place in only a fraction of an instant. It happens so fast that you may not even notice the moment that it takes place. So rather than strain you and ask you to strain, for example, your consciousness into focusing on when you get identified or not, let's talk about the fascination as a cause behind our deep state of unawareness. Samael tells us the cause behind humanity's profound state of sleep is fascination. But from where is it that this comes from? What is fascination itself? Well, fascination comes from fascinus, and that means a charm, an enchantment, a spell. It even means witchcraft. Now, of course, this is the etymological definition of the word fascination. But notice that it doesn't say fascination means distracted. Fascination means absorbed by something else. It tells you a charm, an enchantment, a spell, witchcraft. And as we observe the things that we interact with, the moment that we start realizing that we are wandering through life in this deep state of deep sleep, we then start noticing that even though there is a perception that within each and every one of us, there is an observer, there are aspects of us that attract our attention to certain things, like a metal to a very strong magnet, and that force of attraction is so strong that it is as if we fell under a hypnotic spell, as if we fell under a charm or some kind of witchcraft, but that comes to us from aspects that are contrary to the consciousness itself. Let's take a look at the drunkard, because many people have had the opportunity of try alcohol, and many have done so from a very young age. And as we observe those who have gone into the use and consumption and sometimes the vice of alcohol, we can see that behind their connection with alcohol, there is always some kind of deep struggle. There is always something that feels like a moral pain associated with the causes that led them into the alcohol itself. So the drunkard becomes fascinated with alcohol, and behind that, there is some kind of moral struggle with denied pleasures. There could be a denied struggle around a betrayal or issues with friends. There could be some kind of deep moral problem with a relationship with a man or a woman, etc. So the drunkard identifies himself or herself with some circumstances and fascinates with that suffering and feels the need to escape reality through an artificial means, and then reaches into this particular substance that renders them disconnected from consciously perceiving what those struggles have been. But the same thing happens with the aspect of vanity. And of course, we have this image here of quote unquote the vain woman, but this is just for illustrative purposes. This could have been a vain man as well, or a vain person, irrelevant of their sexuality. But when we see a vain woman or a vain man, we see that they are fascinated with their own enchantments. And they are fascinated with their own enchantments because there has been some sort of identification with a deep struggle. And that struggle could have been dysmorphia, body dysmorphia. That struggle could have been just desire to match certain standards of beauty, etc. But there is a fascination with their own attributes, whether those attributes they see as positive or whether the attributes they see as something that needs to be improved, something that needs to be concealed, or something that needs to be fixed. And we can say the same about the rich. The rich is fascinated with money and properties. But behind that fascination with money and properties, there has been already an identification with some element of envy or ambition or greed, because maybe they feel that they need to have more, that they need to have better. In many cases, the fascination with money and property comes from the identification that those who have less should not do anything to take away anything that belongs to him, that if they want something, they should struggle more to be able to achieve what they want, and that nobody should come and disrupt what they have worked so hard to obtain in this life. So you see, there is an element of identification, there is an element of fascination. And this extends everywhere within our social groups and in many places within our own psychological city. Because even the most honest blue-collar worker, the most honorable man who works to provide for his family and provide for his kids and do a great job, they're still fascinated with their hard work, with the quality of their work, with their union brothers, with their company, with their daily struggles. So we have here something that we also share. I have stated before, we all share this constant quest for happiness. But in addition to that, we also share this situation where we identify with things, with circumstances, and that identification leads us into a hypnotic effect, an enchantment with many other aspects of the things, of the circumstances, and of the consequences that surround us. Look, we even have observed ourselves as parents. And we have seen how is it that parents become fascinated with their children because they see themselves reflected in the actions, in the thoughts, and the behavior of their children. Their fascination with their children leads them to be completely hypnotized with their accomplishments, with their setbacks, etc., etc. This fascination is so deep and it is so intense that many parents feel jealous about the accomplishments of children of other parents. They feel uncomfortable with the highs and lows of children within their community when compared to their own children. So, what is it that we have to do? It is important that we learn to understand the effect of this fascination with our own consciousness. Because for as long as we continue not noticing the instant in which we identify and we slide into the comforts and the enchantments of fascination, we are not going to be able to awaken our consciousness. We will continue living our daydreams. We will continue wandering within our psychological city, and that would lead for us to continue comparing ourselves with others, comparing our properties and our havingness with what anyone else has, and it will keep us in this constant pendulum swing between moments of happiness and moments of sadness, etc., etc. We need to awaken our consciousness because now that we have learned about parallel dimensions, now that we have learned a little bit about unfolding in our astral body, we need to be able to express that sense of awakeness, not only here in the physical plane while we are walking around in our visual state, but also at those moments when our astral body unfolds from the physicality. Maybe we should say, for those of you listening to all these topics for the first time, at those moments when the soul leaves the physical body behind, when the physical body falls asleep. Those things that we do here unconsciously, at the moment that our soul leaves the body, that our astral body unfolds, well, we carry those very same bad habits. We carry the very same level of lack of awareness into the astral plane. And whether we realize it or not, we live during the day unconscious, and when the physical body is sleeping and the astral body has unfolded, the soul has left the body. During the astral experience, we also walk through it unconscious, and as a result, we become completely unable to truly perceive not only what is happening, but to bring back any significant teachings, whether from the day or from the astral experience. As the lunar soul we have today, this cluster of psychological aggregates with consciousness fragmented inside of them, this ego, well, the ego, as it unfolds, it takes all of its dreams into the internal worlds. And then, while the physical body sleeps, we continue doing within the astral plane the same things that keep us in that state of enchantment, in that state of hypnosis within the astral plane as well. And the thing is, people do not ask themselves the question, am I in the physical plane? How often have you not seen yourself in your sleep? And you have seen yourself walking around your house. But suddenly, there are features in the house that do not exist in your physical house. Nevertheless, you are there present in the dream state, perceiving that appearance of your home, and you are not stopping there for a second and saying, wait a minute, what is this? I know that that is not meant to be a lake. That is supposed to be the kitchen. I know that that is not supposed to be a garden. I know that it's not supposed to be a field. That should be another room. But we don't ask ourselves this question. We need to ask ourselves, am I in the physical plane? Even as you're listening to this lecture, we need to ask ourselves, am I here or am I sleeping? Am I in my physical body or am I in the astral plane? And as part of awakening the consciousness, we need to develop some little habits that become edifying and dignifying to the consciousness. If we start asking ourselves this question, am I in the physical plane? We create a habit here that when our physical body is sleeping, we take that habit with us into that fifth dimension, and suddenly you realize, whoa, I am not in my body. And the result will be the inevitable awakening of the consciousness. So what can we do while we're here? Well, we have to start by splitting our attention. But let us tell you this. Splitting our attention is not an exercise for the intellect. Many people think splitting our attention, and they create immediately two worlds. The world of the observer and the world of what is observed, as if both things were independent from each other. And this creates tremendous conflicts for the mind. What we are asking of you to do here, to split your attention, is to go beyond the mind and empower your consciousness to use of its own natural faculties. Let's take a look at this. We need to comprehend that we are asleep. That even though our physical body is walking around, it does not take much observation to realize that it is very difficult to maintain 5, 10, 15 seconds of continuous awareness. The amount of thoughts that are flowing through the stream of the mind are so many, and they are so varied, that because of our conditioning, many thoughts trigger old emotions, old experiences that take us down a tangential path where we start just thinking about stuff that happened, things that we should have said, ways that we should have handled. In many cases, people find themselves cringing at stuff that they said 5 or 10 years ago. So no. We have to comprehend that we are in a vigil state where our physical body is awake, but the consciousness is just asleep. And to continue thinking that we are awakened or enlightened or with some degree of mastery or that I have powers and virtues and all of this stuff, this only furthers that sleep of consciousness. It is the equivalent of the person who thinks that they have already learned everything they must learn about any given subject and automatically shut the door of opportunity to learning something new. We cannot do that to ourselves. It is impossible for us to awaken our consciousness for as long as we continue losing that remembrance of self. And let us tell you this, as you start observing your thoughts, your sentiments, and your actions, you will notice that the cycle is always the same. You identify with something, you fascinate, you fall into that hypnotic enchantment, and you naturally fall into a condition of a deeper sleep of consciousness. Samael tells us, if the student has not awakened their consciousness here, in the physical plane, much less has that consciousness been awakened in the superior planes. Let's stop this here for a second. Many of you listening to this lecture are partaking here, even though you are students of the advanced and the intermediate levels. So let's take some of what you have learned and share it with the public audience in general. When we speak about living life as a path of initiation, we know that all the initiations are meant for the consciousness. The initiations belong to the innermost. All of those initiations that we have gone through, all of those certificates and all of those robes and all of that stuff that we have gotten while here in the physical plane, at the end of the day, they are completely irrelevant. Initiations belong to the being. And we have already learned that there are many different initiations that we must go through. For those of you who are not familiar, we need to go through efforts like overcoming with mastery, the initiations known as the guardian of the threshold. We need to go through initiations of the Hall of Justice, the Hall of Fire, tests of Dairini, the initiations of minor mysteries, all of these things. And many students have already completed many of those requirements. They don't know how many because they are caught in the sleep of consciousness, and they are thus not aware enough to truly understand what is the condition of their own consciousness. What is the level of being, the progress that they have made in their quest, life after life, to once again reunite with the innermost. So you could be going through many lives, achieving great wins, and if you are not aware of those wins, if you're not aware of the accomplishments that have come with a lot of investment and sacrifice, and you decide that you're going to go get drunk and do the unmentionable, many things fall in that category, or if you decide to just move on and use drugs to achieve artificial heightened states of consciousness, if you decide to start sharing yourself with many people in open sexuality and abusing of your creative force, suddenly all of those achievements could be lost. And if you have worked so hard for so long, and what you have accomplished, you are not aware of what you have obtained, then that means that you could be putting yourself at risk simply by ignorance. And we cannot keep making these mistakes. We have to learn to split our attention into 3 focus areas. Again, this is not an exercise for the mind. Everyone who has tried to do this with their intellect has failed catastrophically. This is something that we have to allow the consciousness to do. And we have to empower the consciousness to perceive the subject, to perceive the object, and to perceive the location. All 3 things independently, individually, and at the same time, simultaneously. We have to allow the consciousness to perceive the subject. Now, when we are saying subject, what does that mean? Well, we know very well that we are a combination of 3 things. We are a physical body, we are a soul, and we are a personality. And we have seen our personality in action many times. It is a vehicle that we use to interact with the environment around us. When you are back with your friends from high school, well, you behave with a personality that adapts very well for what you used to do with them. When you remove yourself from the environment and you get into a place that is more formal, well, you adapt your personality so that it can fall in place well and interact in that different environment. So the personality is just an energetic vehicle of interaction. It is something that we create. And the day that we die, that personality is eventually going to fade away. So there is no future for the personality. But there is also our physical body. And our physical body is constantly perceiving because we perceive through our 5 senses. And there are some of you who may still perceive through the faculty of intuition. There are some of you who may have some traces of clairvoyance, and you may perceive through that as well. But as you perceive, well, as a physical body with all of those receptive sensors, the ones associated with the five senses of the human machine, the ones associated to the many sensors that exist within the mind, well, we have to allow the consciousness to say, this thing that I am using to perceive, well, this is part of this package that is the soul, the personality, and the body. This is what makes up the subject. And if you try to task your mind, trying to identify what you're smelling, what you're feeling, what you're sensing, what you're seeing, what you're tasting, the exercise is just going to be way too much. Empower the consciousness, and suddenly, instantaneously, you will find yourself perceiving. And the result of this is that it gives you back an intimate remembrance of self. And that intimate remembrance of self stands above all events and above all of the representations and everything else that may be happening to you. If you do this exercise right now of empowering your consciousness to perceive the subject, you will immediately notice the observer that exists within you. And as you observe, you can clearly see yourself as an actor within the drama, or from an expanded perspective, as the director that contemplates the play and observes both the scenario, the actors, and the interactions between them. And notice how that happens instantaneously, because it is a faculty of the consciousness. This is the subject. But let us tell you this. If our consciousness is fragmented, if there is consciousness trapped in all of those psychological aggregates that we have of anger, because we all experience anger, if there is some other portion of our consciousness trapped within those aggregates that are our lust, if we have consciousness trapped in our ambitions, in our resentments, in our laziness, in our vanities, in our pride, etc., then it becomes difficult to decide which part of the consciousness. So that means that we are relying on that magnetic center that exists within us. That magnetic center is what has brought you to this lecture. And that magnetic center in some people could be 1% free consciousness. In others, it could be 3%, 4%. It is a small fraction of the consciousness. It is a good idea for us to prolong this sensation, this ability to perceive, by invoking of our innermost and saying, Father of mine, let it be you the dominant entity within this human machine. Let it be you to be the one source that occupies the cylinders of this human machine. The actions, the instinctive impulses, the use of the creative force, the intellect, the emotions. Let it be you, the one who perceives. And as you empower your innermost to be the dominant entity in the human machine, then having the ability to perceive the subject, to be present at the current moment, it becomes substantially easier. But that is just the subject. So we empower the consciousness to do this, and we can instantaneously perceive. But what are we perceiving? We are perceiving the object. And the objects are all of the impressions that we receive through the senses. It is what you feel with your hands, what you perceive with your ability to detect scent and taste and sight and hearing, but also the ability to sometimes detect thoughts that are not yours, things that emerge out of nowhere, that feel in some cases dense or that invite some other negative emotions. Those that come as a perception because you have been able to perceive them from the environment, and also those that emerge even from the deeper realms of the mind, the subconscious and the infraconscious mind. All of those things are impressions. And these impressions are received by the senses. Just to keep this simple, let's just focus on the 5 senses that we all share commonly. So anything that you see, anything that you touch, anything that you smell, that you hear, should invite you to bring yourself at a present moment and to look at that in alert novelty, in alert perception, as if you had not seen it before. When we do this, then there is no identification. If there is something that is happening around you, you contemplate it. You remain there at the present moment. And you can perceive it, but you do not identify with the drama. Somebody tells you, you are irresponsible, or you did this bad, you're a bad person. You don't fall into a state of depression. You don't fall into a state of trying to shield yourself and run away. No, you simply stay there. And because it is an exercise of the consciousness, you can then perceive. And as you perceive these objects, because the consciousness is already focusing a third of its attention into the subject itself, you can immediately see the thought that shows up, the emotions that come as a consequence of those thoughts, and even how your body is responding to that flow of thoughts and emotions. Suddenly you see that you are rubbing your hands together, that you are sitting down and that your leg is bouncing up and down incessantly. Suddenly you see that you are just playing with your hair or pulling it and yanking it out of your head. You start noticing all of these things simply because you are empowering the consciousness to perceive. So we perceive the subject. We perceive the object, the stuff, the impressions that are coming into our senses. And the last thing is that you have to deliberately ask yourself, what is this place? What am I doing here? Am I awake? Am I in the astral plane? We must ask ourselves these questions. It is important, imperative that we make this habit. We create that habit here in the physical plane. We carry that habit into the astral plane. And let us tell you this, the moment that you ask yourself, where am I? And you allow that consciousness to perceive, and you look around and you realize you're not in the physical plane, the excitement, at least those first times, is going to be so intense that you're going to come back into your body just like a bolt of lightning. You're going to be, and you're going to awaken and say, I was there. I just perceived this. And these are experiences that charge the consciousness. They create such a positive shock because the more we can consciously perceive, the more we build our faith. Let's remember, faith is not the act of hoping that something better is going to happen later. Faith is in reality those things that we can attest to because we have already had the experiential knowledge of those things. That is what faith ultimately is. It is the ability to live consciously. You don't even have to run it through the intellect or the logic because you already have experienced one or more versions of that specific truth. Versions that are determined by how developed is your level of being. Dear friends, this condition of the intimate remembrance of self is very important. But we have to take basic actions. We have to start observing the way that we speak. We have to start observing the way that we laugh. We have to start observing the way that we walk, the way that we dress, the way that we address our spouse, our neighbors, our children, the way that we speak about them when they are not present. We have to effectively make a decisive effort so that we can keep that attention going for as long as we can. If we can keep that attention for 15 seconds, 4, 8, or 12 times in a day, that may be 3 minutes more than all that we have been able to maintain of awareness in the last couple of years. As we continue expanding those instances, as we continue penetrating deeper into what we are perceiving, those moments of awareness start growing. And before you realize, you're living 1 hour a day conscious, 2 hours, 10 hours. Suddenly you find yourself living consciously for days in a row. But we have to start by splitting our action towards the effort and towards the ego that is being observed. You look at yourself, split that attention, empower the consciousness, contemplate the subject, the object, and the location. And as this is happening, you start seeing your thoughts, you start seeing your emotions, and suddenly you start noticing this aggregate that is reacting is an aggregate of vanity. It is an aggregate of pride. It is an aggregate of frustration. It is an aggregate of self-respect, of self-love, of self-consideration. You start identifying all of these many different personas that exist within you. And that is important because we have to start by developing the ability to observe ourselves. Observation leads us to comprehension. And comprehension is what opens the door to the elimination of those defects. Defect that you eliminate is more conscious, that becomes freed. Your magnetic center becomes stronger. It becomes more powerful. You start perceiving more. It becomes easier to be present. So this is a cycle that builds upon itself. Look at what Samael tells us. Though it may appear incredible, when the students observe themselves, they are not remembering themselves. When they self-observe their laughter, their speech, their walking, they forget about themselves. And that is because in this consideration of us being awake, we tend to believe that because we have access to memories, that we are awake. That because we can feel the sensations of the body, that we are awake. We confuse the ability to feel, to perceive, with the ability to be there at the present moment. And these two things, they can happen concurrently, or the perception of the sensations can still take place while you are yourself in a dream state. And Samael says, we are wherever our consciousness may be. Look, we don't want there to be any type of confusion with this. So if you ever live in a place that tends to get really hot, like those summers in Mexico or those summers in Arizona, you may be driving your car and perceiving the discomfort of the heat. You may even be actively complaining about the heat itself. But if your mind is still thinking about the problem, if your mind is still thinking about the challenges at work, about the difficulties at home, then we are wherever that consciousness is. You may be in the office. You may be at home while your physical body is in the car complaining about the heat. Observe your dynamic, and you will see how these things come into play. But let us give you a word of caution, because as soon as you try to start splitting the attention of your consciousness, you're going to start facing a lot of different challenges. As soon as you try to start comprehending your defects, seeing what thoughts are in the human machine, what sentiments are experienced in the human machine, how is it that your body is reacting, the ego itself is going to fight against that effort. the first thing you will notice is that it will invite the over-rationality of any simple concept. We tell you, empower your consciousness, subject, object, location, and you will, rather than doing that, you will try to empower the mind. And the brain will struggle and you will think, am I doing this? Am I doing it enough? Is this sufficient? Should I look at my thoughts now? And before long, the confusion and the chaos in the mind is so tremendous that you say, yeah, I'm not going to do this now. Let me embrace the next thought that brings me some pleasure, that eliminates, that replaces this inconvenient suffering. And you receive that thought, identify with it, you fascinate with those thoughts, and you go back into the sleep of consciousness. Look, when you try to observe your aggregates of anger, there are some people that say, wow, I must have already eliminated my anger. It's been 2 weeks. I don't remember getting angry. And then something little happens. Somebody honks the horn for 2 seconds too long, or somebody steals the parking spot at the supermarket, or you forget about the stuff that you had to pick up from the shelves in the supermarket by the time that you get back home. And any little thing invites an explosion of anger that is completely disproportionate to the causes themselves. If you try to comprehend your lust itself will invite conditions of fornication. And they will not be brutally clear. They will come around in such a subtle way that they will seduce you and lure you into finding yourself in conditions where you are abusing of your sexual creative power. Your ego itself, as you try to observe your anger, is going to bring you instances where you're going to find yourself in quarrels and in arguments. The moment that you try to look at your greed, if you're not careful, you will not see how is it that your greed convinces you that it is important to develop faculties and powers and anything that really belongs to the consciousness. And soon enough, you will be experiencing spiritual greed. So these defects, if there is a takeaway from this, is that they're not going to show up in ways that are scary. These defects are not going to show up in ways that are immediately evident. They will show up in ways that will invite you to start coming up with agreements, accepting certain things as okay, to become overly reasonable with things. And soon enough, you would have walked deep enough into that swamp that you will find yourself seriously smeared. So this is the word of caution. The ego is very clever at everything that it does. And the antidote to that is self-remembrance. What is that? This is realizing the subconscious processes of the ego. We split the consciousness into focusing its attention into subject, object, and location. And as you become able to contemplate your environment, as you're standing there in this current moment, you start noticing how is it that the ego is inviting thoughts, how the ego is inviting actions, how it is inviting negative emotions. You can start seeing how your instinctive impulses take over, how your sexual energies become abused. How is it that you realize suddenly that you have been absorbed mentally by a problem for weeks, if not for months? It shows you what is happening in each one of the 5 cylinders of the human machine. So again, observe the way you speak. Observe the way that you laugh, that you walk, that you eat, what you feel, how you respond to others. This type of observation starts developing the spatial sense. You see yourself, you see the perceptions of the consciousness, and suddenly that sphere of perception starts growing, and it gives you this spatial sense where suddenly your electrical hypersensitivity is enough to even feel when somebody close to you is close. When someone is thinking of you, and through that continuum of time and space, you can perceive those thoughts, which is what is known as the faculty of telepathy, etc. Focusing our attention into awakening the consciousness allows us to make a progression, as if we were taking steps on a stairway, because there are 4 basic states of consciousness. The first one is the sleep state. That is when the physical body is asleep. The second one is the waking consciousness. That is known as the vigil state. And these 2 aspects are inferior. The superior states of consciousness are the auto-consciousness or the self-consciousness, when you can carry the consciousness continually. And last, the objective consciousness, when you can sustain that degree of awareness continuously. Continually means that sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. And continuously means that it is always happening. Look, this first state of the physical body sleeping, where both the physical body and the consciousness are asleep, this is known as a state of akasia. Akasia is a Greek word. Here, the body is sleeping. The soul leaves the body. You go in an astral projection. But because our soul is lunar, it is just an ego with clusters of ego, with consciousness trapped, fragmented, broken. Well, your body is sleeping, but the ego is then sleepwalking and projecting its dreams in the astral plane. You will see that there is no logic in the dreams. The psychic functions work with no particular direction. The scenery is incoherent. There is no continuity. Many people have had experiences of dreaming, and in their dreams, they're walking down the stairs in their house. But their physical house has no stairs. But they don't question that. And when they get to the bottom floor, suddenly there's a crocodile in the living room. And they say, "Oh, a crocodile. Better not touch it." And they keep walking around without stopping for a second and say, wait a minute. What is this? I don't have stairs. Why is there a croc in the living room? Where am I? Am I in the physical plane? Am I in the astral plane? What am I perceiving? They don't go through that exercise. And if they did, just if they did, it would give them such a positive shock of consciousness. It would give them that conscious moment in a superior dimension. That opens the door to so many new possibilities. But then we wake up in the morning and we spend the day in this condition of waking consciousness. In Greek, this is known as pistis. And this is when the ego returns to the physical body. And this is just another form of sleep. In this case, this is the most dangerous of the conditions, because the physical body is doing things, but the dreams continue internally. You see, we continue trapped in this daydream while the physical body is awake. And we may get in the car and drive from here to there and get there and not even realize how we got there. We may be at work dealing with dangerous equipment, and suddenly we lose a finger or we have an accident and we create chaos in our lives. So this is a very dangerous condition. We are seeking to bring this key of SOL, subject, object, and location, into this waking consciousness phase, so that we can allow the consciousness to perceive, so that we can be there at the present moment, contemplating, seeing our dynamic with others, understanding our defects, seeing how is it that we can best contribute, how is it that we can best stop much of the harm that we do during the day, saying things that we don't mean, taking actions that complicate events, lying, hiding our fears, etc. Just seeking to see the roots of all that so that we can get rid of it and slowly move into a condition of higher happiness. Now, in the 2 superior states, there's this state of dianoia. This is self-consciousness or auto-consciousness. This is a stage of awakening in which the practitioner acquires consciousness of self. Samael says, if anyone were to awaken, they'd be ashamed of themselves. They would immediately comprehend their antics and their ridiculousness. To that statement, we could say that as we look at some of the things that we have done in the past, some of the things that we have said, if we cringe, those moments when we say, did I really say that? Did I really do that? See, those are moments, lower moments, but moments of consciousness themselves. We just have to stop thinking that we can only look at what we have done and rather bring that ability so that we can detect all of that in the current state, in the current time. The state of continuous consciousness is nous. And this is a state of objective consciousness. This state of awareness is that corresponds to the great masters. Masters like Buddha, like Jesus, Hermes Trismegistus, Paracelsus, Galeno, the angels, the archangels, they live in a state of objective consciousness. We strive for this type of awakening, but we cannot get there until we start doing the work here at this moment and in the physical plane. Because we bring our bad habits into the dream state. Well, as we start working with these things, suddenly we start noticing that we can become contemplative of our own dreams. And some people dream that they are awake in their dreams. And they say, whoa, I was there and I was not doing anything. I was just watching everything happening around me. They say, I could even change the way the dream was going by just willing it. This is what they say. They say, I can change my dream. Friends, the fact that you can do that is remarkable. The fact that you're aware, that's great. But we cannot think, you cannot think that you are in a state of awakened consciousness. Because all along, what you have been doing is toying, playing with your dream the same way that somebody would play here turning knobs in a machine. The same way someone would be playing with Play-Doh and changing the shape of the object that they're creating. While sleeping, we may experience those sparks of vigil state while in the dream. While in the vigil state, we may experience some sparks of dianoia, of self-awareness. And those who are in dianoia, well, they will experience some sparks of nous. But we cannot think that we are at the next level. You know when you are at the next level? You are at the next level the moment that you can use your consciousness the way that you use your hands today. Not only you know that you have them, you can use them deliberately to do whatever it is that you need them to do. And this is how you know. So we must focus first on empowering the consciousness to perceive the subject, the object, and the location. And as we do this, to create for ourselves the right space-time so that we can contemplate everything that is happening around us. Now we're saying empower the consciousness. People tend to confuse the consciousness with many things. People tend to think, oh, my intelligence is the consciousness. My intellect, that's consciousness. They say, oh, my body feels this or that, or I bathe it, or I have to satisfy some bodily function, so that is consciousness. Or they say, well, I feel sad, or I feel joyful. I feel angry. That has to do with consciousness. I touch my skin and I can feel that, so that is consciousness. No, those are combinations of electric impulses, signals that come from the brain, and of course the ability of the brain being an instrument of the mind to reach out and retrieve memories from the mind itself. Consciousness is something a little different. Consciousness is the apprehension, the grabbing, not the grasping, the grabbing of internal wisdom independent of all mental activity. The consciousness has instinctive, inspiring, and imaginative faculties that allow you to see beyond the appearance of things, that allow you to understand the significance and the reasons of things without having to go into logic, without having to be comparing. The consciousness, in its innate abilities, it can reveal to you the spiritual significance of things without making use of the mind. So the consciousness is extremely powerful. And we cannot confuse the consciousness or a condition of awakened consciousness because you can remember, or because you can think, or because your hand feels. You touch the hot cup of coffee and you perceive it. Consciousness is entirely energetic. And, well, there are different degrees of consciousness. Just like we have the level of consciousness of a saint that we can agree that is a level of consciousness that is high. And there is the level of consciousness of the pervert. We can agree that it is a very low, inferior state of consciousness. So with consciousness being different, of it existing and manifesting in different degrees, knowing that energy is constant in the universe. All of you have heard this scientific postulate that energy cannot be created, it can only be transformed. Energy is constant. That is one of the fundamental laws of thermodynamics. So with everything being energy, our consciousness is energetic in nature. And the varying degrees of consciousness are dictated by how intense and prevailing that energy is. If we were to look at this wave of energy that we have in the screen, the higher those peaks go, the stronger is the presence of that consciousness. If we have peaks that are very slow, very low, and it's a line, and instead of being a wave, it almost becomes a flat line, well, we know that there is a very weak consciousness there. This is so inherently true that when we are measuring vital signs, we look at the oscillations of the rhythm of the heart as a way to detect if there is the possibility of that body being conscious. At least a possibility of that body to be considered, quote unquote, alive, able to feel and perceive. And we know that when it stops, that wave, when it goes flatlined, we know that the consciousness has ceased to be there. This is something that we know. We can also look at how often those peaks repeat themselves. Because as we're trying to awaken the consciousness, you may see that there is a really big peak, and that peak does not repeat itself until a week or 2 weeks after. But what happens when we start bringing that heightened state of awareness and those peaks start happening several times a day, several times an hour? What about several times a minute? The more awakened the consciousness, the stronger this energetic signature becomes manifest. And the more we can penetrate into the mysteries of nature, the more we can penetrate into the higher dimensions, like the fifth dimension, moving there consciously in our astral body, the more we would be able to become conscious of the reality of our existence. We would like to close today with the words of Master Samael Aung Weor. And we leave these words, hopefully deposit them in your heart and in your consciousness so that you can reflect on them. And he says, "The illusion of being continually conscious is the product of memory and all the processes of thought. Being able to retrospect is not equivalent to an awakened consciousness. This is merely the act of remembering unconscious acts. This is why Samael invites us to do retrospection. This is why we have so much retrospection in our weekly Gnostic labs. Because following this direction, what Samael needs us to do is do retrospection. Why? Because we need to become aware of our actions. We need to become aware of all of our acts. Friends, we were able to source the material for this lecture from Samael's lecture titled The Revolution of the Consciousness, from his writings in the books The Perfect Matrimony, The Collar of the Buddha, The Esoteric Treatise of Hermetic Astrology, and his book, The Fundamentals of Gnostic Education. And as always, we are always very grateful to all of these sources because thanks to them, we have been able to put this material together. Dear friends, this has been our lecture, The Awakening of the Consciousness. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here with us this evening. May all beings be happy.